like how one of the last sentences was just, but we actually don't care much for a theory of decline. I was like, okay. It's like, why did I read this? Like, this is like, whatever.
I mean, in some respects, the whole essay was, we don't care for a theory of decline, and here's why you shouldn't either. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I was like, give me the decline. So wait, did you not have the their introduction on yours that was written like a decade later or something at least?
Maybe I didn't. I did not read an introduction. No, you'll have to tell me what was in their introduction. When was this? Funny. I don't even know when this was written.
I think the early 90s or the mid 90s, something like that. Yeah. I think so I started the essay as you would normally start an essay from the beginning, and then anyway, the introduction was like they immediately start it by being like, and here's why we think this is a bad essay now that we look at it in hindsight, and here's all of the things that we got wrong. And it was, whatever, we can get into that in a bit. I thought they were all very good and very interesting, but I think basically a lot of that just came from them being insecure and probably agreeing with some of the theory company stuff. But again, neither of us have actually read the theory company's critique, so who knows?
Yeah, we'll have to table that episode for
yeah. That's the most pretentious sounding episode we've ever done. We're reading the theory company's critique of Aufheben's article on decline and decadence. If anybody ever asks me what I'm reading, I'm just gonna lie if we ever do that. Like, oh my god. Did it by the way, did it bother you that they used the term decadence in this, or was that just me?
It did not bother me.
Bother might be the wrong word.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, if I was forced to reflect on it now, maybe I would have a certain understanding for what decadence would mean that I'd feel like this piece wasn't necessarily engaging with fully. I mean, I feel like it was critiquing more particular political response to, or how particular theories of crisis and capitalist collapse have influenced people's strategic attitudes throughout the past 100 years prior to its writing, I guess. Whereas I suppose my immediate understanding of decadence theory, which is the one that's being discussed here, is to say that capitalism had a sort of progressive ascendant phase and then slips into a phase of decadence where it's sort of like outlived its historical usefulness and has become a fetter on sort of objective historical development, I suppose. Should we pretend this isn't the third time that we've tried this?
Yeah, Jesus Christ.
No, I mean, there you go. There is my interpretation of what the word decadence means. Should I have been otherwise offended, or
no? I mean, I think for me, I just always thought of decadence and decline. I mean, this is just because I was just uninformed. I just always thought of decadence and decline as two different things. Like I feel like you never really see the term decadence brought up in kind of like Marxist-y circles. Decadence, I always kind of thought it was anything from like a liberal to like a reactionary kind of take, right? Where it's like either, on one hand, the industrialists aren't investing in a Protestant enough way, or you don't have the right technocrats, or it's, the weak men, strong men make bad times bullshit, right? Where it's like, we're too woke these days. But it didn't bother me so much as I was just like, oh, interesting. Like, I feel like all of the thinkers that they're engaging with, at least in the time where I was like locked in reading this, meaning the like Second International stuff, I understand it. I don't think they use the term decadence. I was just kind of wondering where they got it from, but decadence, decline.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose they do mean different things, and I suppose it's possible that there could be a conflation of things happening here, right? Now, I think for the purposes of making the argument they're attempting to make, I think that I'm happy with the grouping of these particular people together to reinforce an argument that a certain sort of like interpretation of Marxism has taken hold within some of the historic parties and groupings of the workers' movement, and that may have been both not in keeping with what was intended by Marx, but also not strategically beneficial to the sort of the furtherance of the advance of communism, I suppose. So I'm content with the structure of the argument they're attempting to make, I think. Although I suppose there are probably some people that have a historical analysis that could be more aptly defined as a decadence theory as opposed to a particular type of crisis or crisis theory or theory of decline, I suppose. But that might be splitting of hairs, I think.
Yeah. No, fair enough. We'll get into, I think, all the more specifics of what we're talking about, I guess, too. I was just kind of thinking, it seemed like they were just talking about decline when they said decadence, but moot point, doesn't actually matter at all.
I don't know. No, it's well put, because I'm sure you could write a piece purely on theories of capitalist decadence, theories of the progressive social role that capitalism had potentially fulfilled, and how it had become now a fetter on human societal development rather than a progressive cause or a progressive force, I suppose. Maybe that's not what, because I guess you could talk about decadence from the long durée of human history, or you could think about decadence purely in terms of an ascendant and descendant period of any one mode of production unrelated to the preceding one or the future one, I suppose. So maybe there are two different approaches to using that word historically that is worth not confusing or conflating.
Yeah, I think you're right. And because I just think when I think of decadence, I don't think he ever used the term, but I kind of think of the Wallerstein stuff.
You just think of like Roman emperors, sort of like
feeding,
we fed too many Christians to the lions, and then we ate too many grapes whilst being fanned by slaves.
Yeah, they needed the Illyrian generals to come in, refresh the Roman bloodlines, get rid of the decadence. You put me onto this. No, I think when I think of decadence, I would think more of the when again, he didn't use this term in the reading that we did, but the Wallerstein essay that he wrote about how all the bourgeoisie now are just aristocrats, there's this tendency. And because I think he didn't really back that up with a materialist Marxism, like an economics or something like that, feels closer to what I imagine decadence to be, which is a cultural softening, not backed up by any real, well, what do you mean by softening, and what is it? Where is this coming from? Because, Wallerstein's point in that essay was pretty correct, right? Where it's because it's also not particularly a crazy point, because he's just because there are fewer opportunities for investment profitably in productive industries now, you're just seeing capitalists with way too much money, nowhere to put it all, and just, being sickos, right? That's more of what I kind of feel like is a decadence thing. But yeah, I don't know. I don't actually even know. I don't, what I printed out, I don't actually have the name of the essay. We should probably say what it was. It was the Aufheben essay on decadence. Is what it was. Do you have it in front of you, what it was called?
No.
Okay.
Purely on account of technical difficulties. Come on, I can.
Fair enough. We don't need to relitigate that.
Yes. Yeah. The Aufheben essay on decadence that could more properly be described as an essay on economic crisis.
Yeah, exactly. And this was a 3-part series of articles that came out, I think, like we said, I think early 90s, mid 90s, sometime like that. In the version that I was reading, they do an introduction where they're actually, we feel like we would have written this completely differently and changed the topic entirely had we done this now. Fair enough, whatever. I think this started because some of the Aufheben people in England, in the introduction, they mentioned going to a meeting that either they set up or that was set up to kind of talk about decline, and front and center, there were a bunch of ICC people who basically the entire meeting were actually, we already have a worked out party line on decline, and anybody who thinks anything else, you're actually just wrong. So we don't need to think about it anymore. Anyway, I think that this series of articles came out as a way to criticize both the kind of left communist take on a theory of capitalist decline, as well as like a typical kind of Trotskyist, then Leninist, and then what they describe as like an orthodox Marxist take on decline. So I think it's kind of right up our alley for a lot of stuff we've been talking about recently. There's like when we spoke with Phil Neal, we talked all about crisis, what it means to actually theorize capitalism in crisis. And the only other thing I'll say to kind of get us started is that like this almost feels a bit dated now because it's like really obvious. I feel like the capitalism is in crisis now. We're like, I was born in the 90s, so I don't actually know anything about the poll tax stuff, the cultural feeling was like back then. But like, you were getting people make the argument, Marxists make the argument that like, well, I mean, it might all, what is decline really? What is decadence really? And it's like, it feels like if this were to be rewritten now, there would be a lot more, well, it is all in crisis. It is absolutely all falling apart. We know that less so from any kind of like, hard-headed analysis on our part, you and I, Dan, of like, the world economy, and more so just like you experience it in every aspect of your life now. So yeah, it's interesting. It felt a little bit dated because it's like, don't need to convince me. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, what is there to be convinced of? I guess sort of like the narrative of this piece and the theorists that they're engaging with. There was a period of time in the middle of the 20th century where it was plausible to hypothesize that the sort of boom and bust cycle of capitalism had ended, and the sort of like overseers of capitalism, I suppose, had sort of like ended crisis entirely. Obviously, that sort of narrative collapsed in the 1970s. I suppose now we're in a position where we're faced with the prospect of a capitalist crisis in decline, not resulting in any necessarily sort of like evident opportunity structures for the left, or like a natural response from the natural formation of a revolutionary class or a movement to overthrow capitalism purely as a result of the evident crisis situation that capitalism is in, kind of thing. So it does highlight the sort of the really interesting sort of tension that is the crux of this piece, right? Which is this this distinction between are we reliant on, is capitalism the cause of its own end? Does it have an inbuilt sort of tendency of crisis and collapse, which will bring about its end and has a corollary? I don't know. Has a related tendency, which also brings about the force which will replace it, or is the tendency that brings about the crisis or the same tendency that brings about the replacement of capitalism, I suppose? In other words, what I'm saying is it just purely a sort of like a feature of the economic working of the system, or does it necessitate some kind of subjective force, irrespective of the economic opportunity structures presented by any particular moment of the sort of like success or failure of the capitalist system to reproduce itself on a sort of like basic economic level, I suppose.
Yeah, and how that relates to class struggle, right? Like,
well, quite, yeah.
Because I think that's kind of like the main point that they're talking about here is like, Aufheben, they're like, a collection of ultra leftists, and the structure of this essay is basically they go through loads of theories of decline from like the Second International on, to kind of talk about how a theorizing of capitalism's eventual collapse plays into people's politics. And like good ultra leftists, they basically, the moral of these essays is if your theory of crisis doesn't put the working class front and center, it's not really worth much, which I think is fair. And we'll get into kind of the specifics of that here in a bit. But like, this definitely made me rethink some things, or at least kind of not quite like a paradigm shift, but it made me rethink a lot of specifically the Second International theories of decline. And maybe you can kind of speak to those here in a sec. But I think one of the things I always find really interesting is seeing how very clearly the popular ideologies and theories on the left reflect the material fortunes of capital accumulation in their given time. And they kind of step in. They don't step in for Bernstein. Obviously, no one's going to step in for Bernstein, but they kind of give a really good explanation for why Bernstein had his politics, because in kind of like the lead up to his time, you had all of these theories about we need socialism because capitalism's, there's this tension between the productive forces and the social relations of society. It's there's this big, long, drawn out depression in kind of the like 1870s and 1880s. It seems like nothing's ever really, like, it doesn't seem like capitalism can actually save itself. And then all of a sudden it does, which is kind of the moral of all of these different stories in here, where it's like, how is capitalism going to weasel its way out of this one? And then it easily weasels its way out of this one, right? Like, and then eventually when it does, and there's this period of prosperity in like the 1880s and the 1890s, and then in the lead up to the turn of the century as well, and kind of onward for a few decades from there until like the Great Depression, you see people like Bernstein be like, well, maybe we don't actually need to be revolutionary, because actually, like, if this collapse isn't happening on its own, we can use the structures that capitalism has created to kind of like further socialize. And this was kind of, one of his main errors is kind of like viewing, finance, capital, and monopolies and stuff like this as a further socialization of the productive process, as opposed to just capitalism saving itself and further entrenching itself in society. He was like, well, why can't we just use these structures, the bourgeois state, to actually just do socialism in a nice way without a revolution? Which, we all hate Bernstein. Bernstein was obviously wrong, but like, you can't fault a guy for seeing revolutions in the past and being like, well, maybe, I'm giving him too much credit here, because obviously he was just an opportunist and just wanted like bureaucratic and political power like everybody else did. But the theory you can understand when it very quickly you see this decline that was supposed to usher in the total collapse that gave you the choice between socialism or barbarism. It didn't happen. And in fact, actually things got better for, the average Western European worker there for a little while. Like, you can understand why that theory was created, I guess is all I'm saying.
It's really interesting how many different theories and how many radically different tendencies can seemingly, according to the narrative of this piece anyway, seemingly base their political theory and their political strategy on a sort of set of assumptions that come from this theory of capitalism having some kind of decline tendency, or rather, I mean, I guess in the sort of Bernsteinian case, in the reformist case, but also in the kind of like general, in the thinking of the center tendency within the Social Democrats as well, with people like Kautsky, for example. There is this idea that, as you were just saying, like the capitalism is creating certain tendencies which overcome its trajectory toward crisis. And at the beginning of the 20th century, for the sort of Social Democrats, it was this kind of like Hilferding idea of finance capital, but also like this greater monopolization of the capitalist economy within a smaller and smaller number of larger economic entities, which then could potentially be taken over by a sort of new worker state. So it was kind of like capitalism's response to its sort of changing tendencies was potentially creating the sort of opportunity structures for a movement toward a new mode of production, crucially not requiring a sort of like creative process of a revolutionary subject. It's all the sort of all the sort of economic production of the system, rather than any kind of like sort of subjective requirement for agency. But the thing that I found most interesting about this discussion of this period of time and these thinkers was that the idea that sort of like the idea of the implication, maybe I'm misreading it, but what I was understanding was being said was that there's almost an extent to which a particular sort of set of theorizing around the relationship of capitalist crisis to sort of like progressive onward movement of history was almost like a unifying thing within almost all elements of the social democratic left at this time, whether it was like a particular understanding by the sort of reformists, or Kautsky's particular interpretation, or even Rosa Luxemburg's interpretation, for somebody who wrote so vociferously against the social democratic right and wrote so favorably of sort of like worker struggle and the centrality of the class struggle and how important it was. Like this, wrote in a famous pamphlet about the new phenomena of the mass strike, right, was like really responsive to the sort of independent activity of the working class. Still, her economic theories were about what are the limiting factors to the expansion of capitalism. So yeah, what I came away with was a potentially false idea, but an idea that there was almost this like unifying sort of something coming. What all elements of the Social Democratic Party were using this sort of broad theory of sort of crisis and decline to, it was almost like a unifying thing. It was something that almost bound them all together and almost allowed them all to operate in the same political party for at least a little while, I suppose. And as you say, it's just a series of ideas that then went on to influence Lenin and Leninism and post-Leninist groupings, and then also left communist tendencies throughout the 20th century as well, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all very like a very fatalistic, very mechanistic, but also very like evolutionary understanding, kind of like the worst parts of the worst Marxism, a kind of like natural evolution. First you get feudalism, or first you get ancient mode, then you get feudalism, then you get this, then you get that, then you eventually get socialism. And it was interesting because I kind of take that critique, which is really similar to 6 years ago when we read that Hillary Putnam essay, where he's kind of like criticizing a kind of like Karl Popper approach to science, or an approach to science that's very bourgeois, which is we're slowly going to eventually reach the totality of human knowledge, and really like taking the actual circumstances that scientists practice science and completely abstracting away from that and just believing that there's this kind of like secular approach to knowledge getting. Whereas Putnam is like, that's not really the case. Like, you have to look at how science is being practiced, all this different stuff. It's a similar approach to history in this essay, where it's like socialism shouldn't be taken for granted. I think that a lot of these kind of second international types would probably also agree with that. But they're also kind of saying like, you can't really think of it as the natural result of the kind of like capitalist economy, and all proles have to do is just inherit this eventual, total socialization of the production process, and that's all you have to do. And this is really interesting because I don't really know the lineage of a lot of the ultra lefty stuff, but you can really see where like the endnotes, obviously, crowd and the kind of like modern ultra lefty crowd get their understanding of communism as it's not just, central planning, obviously. Like, it's this creation of this subject. It's, it's the real work of the working class themselves. And the thing that I took from this that I really, really liked was this idea that like, you can't think of socialism in this kind of mechanistic way, and you can't think of it as the solution to the anarchy of the market. I think that was like a quote or something in here where they were like, you can't counterpose rational socialist planning to the anarchy of the market, and that's all we're trying to fix. Because that eventually, it did with the SPD, it eventually just becomes a kind of technocracy, and it completely takes away what communism is actually about, which is just getting rid of class once and for all and allowing people to like do what they want regardless of being told what to do by an alien force, right? It's like getting rid of alienated labor and allowing for this kind of communal reproduction of life, which some people do just take to mean planning, rational planning. And, who can blame them? Like, today, it's like, God damn it, the market is so obviously bad at not just allocating social labor, but like maintaining our global ecosystem, that it's like, it's all the socialism or barbarism thing really is looking kind of more and more correct every day. But Aufheben takes a really interesting approach where they're like, that's a bad dichotomy, socialism or barbarism, because it completely takes away this agency from proles. And it's just kind of like, well, we either need to let it happen or it's all going to fall apart. And as you say, the interesting thing about that is like in the Second International, they critique Bernstein just as much as Rosa Luxemburg, because while they appreciate Rosa Luxemburg as someone who maintained her revolutionary credentials and was very much revolutionary in her politics, especially compared to the rest of the SPD, she was someone that still believed in this kind of mechanistic approach to the adoption of socialism. Dan just dropping it out. There he is. I just kind of kept talking, but I kind of lost my train of thought. But anyway, Luxemburg was also somebody who kind of had this mechanistic approach in their mind to the transition to socialism, because for her, socialism was running out of non-capitalist Marxists or non-capitalist markets, right? And for her, that was her theory of decline, where it's like, well, eventually, it's a quantitative question. Eventually, capitalism is going to run out of these markets that it can't just, dump all of its accumulated profits on and expand capitalism that way. So it's all going to fall apart. This is a theory of decline, and it's going to happen soon. So we need to have a revolution. They're kind of saying, if your theory of socialism is socialism or barbarism, that's still a very mechanistic approach, because you're kind of just saying, well, we either need to inherit this enormous productive apparatus and run it more rationally, or, it's all going to fall apart, which might be true, but to them, and I think this is a good point, it still does take agency away from building a working class movement. It's a bit technocratic, which, to be fair, is what the SPD was, so whatever.
They did a really good job in this piece of, just returning to what I was saying before, of explaining how it was possible that people could come away with wildly different wildly different sort of strategic and political attitudes while still continue to exist in the same movement to some extent. And they do an interesting job of explaining how a good number of people within the SPD, the sort of German Social Democrats, could maintain the idea that it was necessary to have a revolutionary force to build up the political party, have a narrative about the necessity of the proletariat as this sort of history-making force, but then subvert that in a direction which was actually turned them into a force which was simply going to take things that were created by capitalism and put them to some other end. So, it's the idea of these great monopolies that were created by capitalism are going to be taken over by the state and run by the workers and planned by, economic organizations that were going to come out of the Social Democratic Party, I suppose, and run a state as a worker state, which I think is really important. It's the central argument of this piece, and I'm glad you sort of bring it up now, is this idea that really in Marxism, for Marx, the working class has a totally different role, and it's one in which, as you say, that famous quote, the job of emancipating the working class is for the working class itself, and in this context, it's not for capitalism to create or present the structures which are going to allow for the emancipation of the working class. The fundamental thing that, and this is an interesting challenge to some things that I think I've come to believe, or some articulations of my thinking that I've tried to make, which is this idea that what's intended to be overcome, and you referenced this before, the role of a revolutionary process is not intended to overcome sort of the anarchic productive processes of capitalism. It's not intended to overcome the anarchy of the market and replace it with some kind of efficient economic planning. And sometimes my thinking goes in that direction. Socialism is a planned economy rather than a sort of one dominated by private property. It's one dominated by collective control, which would allow for rational economic planning. The argument they're making is it's not this sort of this contradiction between anarchic production and versus rational planning, but rather it's this contradiction internal to capitalist social relations itself, which alienates workers from the work that they do and sort of like transforms their labor into some kind of like abstracted form in the form of the commodity. So really sort of like bringing us back to the sort of like central tenets of Marx's critique of capitalism, best articulated for me, I guess, in Isaac Rubin's book, right? Like, if there is a good touchstone for what it is they're actually trying to articulate as being the central argument of Marxist economists, economics, it's in Rubin's analysis of commodity fetishism and the contradiction in the social relation there, which results in people being alienated from their labor. But yeah, for the writers of this piece, the central and most important element of capitalism is the alienation of workers, and the only people that are able to overcome that alienation are the workers in their own process of emancipating themselves. Capitalism isn't going to create the appropriate machines or sort of like technocratic or bureaucratic organizational structures that allow for that to happen. It's only the working class working out how they're going to first liberate themselves and then live as liberated humans that will define socialism and the process of revolution. I guess not. Capitalism isn't going to define it for us, I suppose.
It's a really good point. I'm glad you bring up the commodity fetishism stuff because, yeah, again, like that is the key to kind of understanding what it is that makes our labor alien and makes the entire production process, entire productive apparatus completely alien to us and, alien to capitalists as well, right? It's not like they really get to decide what they make, and it's, the key to understanding why our labor isn't considered social, even though we're engaging in the reproduction of society whenever we go to work, right? Even if it's society that fucking sucks. It's a good point too, I think, to bring up, like, we need to remember that socialism isn't just, this is something we've talked about before, like socialism isn't just the negation of capitalism. Like, it's the negation of capitalism insofar as this is the class society that we've been given that we have to operate against, right? But it's the end of class society, period, right? It's like, it's the creation of something entirely new, something that we haven't really seen before, like socialized production plus classless society. Like, we need to remember that. We need to remember that when we think about what communism is, what socialism is, whatever, like it isn't just bizarro capitalism. You don't really want to think like that. And the kind of worst way of thinking about that is just socialism is capitalism, but without all of the irrationalities. Like, we're not going to waste all these potatoes when COVID comes around. We're not going to, have these completely incoherent supply lines, right? It's like, yeah, all of that stuff will naturally come about because we're like collectively reproducing a society without class. Like, the core of what communism is a classless society, right? It's not, it's not that everything builds from it being more rational. It's that it is more rational because we're finally given control over like our work and what we want to see in society. And you touched on something there that I just want to briefly get to as well. I really love it whenever anyone kind of takes that way of that like analysis of socialism and kind of applies it to bourgeois revolutions. Because for me, I'm constantly like, well, how did the bourgeoisie do it? How did they do it in France? How did they do it in England? How did they manage to take over political power? And so many left strategists do just build themselves off of the bourgeois model of revolution. They make the really good point here, which we've come across elsewhere, which is just, hey, all the bourgeoisie had to do was just affirm themselves in society. The society was headed in this direction economically. They were already a class. They just needed to shake off these old fetters, which has been done to varying degrees across the world, and let production kind of run them. You know what I mean? And it was, I'm not going to say it was easy. Like, it was obviously very difficult in some places, but, we don't really have that place in society. Like, obviously, like, proles are a class, just like the bourgeoisie was and continues to be a class, but we're also kind of trying to get rid of class. So it's not so much affirming our place as just abolishing. Now I sound like a real ultra leftist, but like completely abolishing class everywhere, right? Like once and for all, and all of the rationality and all of the good stuff that we all want to see, all of the, target algorithms and all of that shit, like that all comes naturally. But like, yeah, it's not just capitalism, but more rational. It's always a red flag whenever anybody starts talking about socialism like that. It's like People's Republic of Walmart stuff. It's like, okay, I see whose side you're on.
I really loved that quote so much. I was so thrilled by it. The sort of like the affirmation versus abolition bit. So I'm glad you remind me of that. I guess what I will say is like this did cause some self-reflection. Like obviously we've talked about this idea of the working class emancipating itself, and but it's always so easy to wish for some kind of economic process that's going to be responsible for doing it. We don't have to fall for the kind of like sort of Hilferdingian monopoly capitalism understanding to fall for other versions of this, which sort of like sees our liberation in purely economic processes. I mean, like it's things like the idea of like breakdown theories of capitalism that we've come across before, and sort of reading about the tendential fall in the rate of profit and ideas like this. That is something that I sometimes like make this same mistake in, of thinking that like the opportunity structures will be presented by the crisis of capitalism. Like, people will be forced into responding because capitalism is making their existence untenable, because capitalism has been making its own existence untenable, kind of thing. Which I feel like this piece also sort of presents and offers a critique of that kind of thinking as well. I kind of did want to talk about the kind of like the sections of this where they talk about ideas about the tendential fall in the rate of profit, changes in the organic composition of capitalism, the sort of like the idea that capitalism has this inbuilt tendency to replace workers with machines, and as a result alter the organic composition of capitalism and reduce the amount of labor that's goes into making commodities, and therefore reduce the amount of the value of each commodity, and ultimately undermine its the rate of profit of the system as a whole. I found there to be some really valuable corrections to that idea in this piece, and it is stuff that we've encountered before, right? Like we read Fossil Capitalism by Andreas Malm, and that had big sections, and put a lot of the emphasis of his argument on the idea of capitalism responding to the resistance of workers, and it actually being like workers resisting capitalism which led to the development of new machinery. So it's not like capitalism is just as a default always looking for ways to replace workers and laborers with machines, but it's like it's the back and forth of the class struggle. It's the resistance of workers to the process which results in this process. So I guess what I'm intending to say is like, whereas before we were emphasizing the argument that class struggle is the thing that's central to the making of revolution, not the mechanistic operations and developments and eventual decline of capitalism. It's the actual activity of workers that make revolution. But also in non-revolutionary times, there's also an element of whereby it's class struggle. It's the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which defines some of these supposedly economic processes. We could see things like the tendential fall in the rate of profit as being simply a mechanistic feature of the capitalist economy, when really it's actually a feature of the social relations of capitalism. It only comes about by virtue of the fact that capitalism cannot exist without one class appropriating the labor of another, creating an alienated class which resists those conditions of alienation. So yeah, at all stages in capitalism, there is this sort of like it's the social relations and the resulting class struggle which is determinative of historical development, not some objective economic process, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up fossil capital, because that's exactly what I was thinking about when I was reading this too. The historical parts of that book are so good, like as just like a concrete analysis of understanding why these technologies, as you're saying, like get adopted. And he makes the point in that book where it's like, it didn't make financial sense in the short term for capitalists to be doing this. They lost a lot of money, like immediately relocating all of their renewable, windmills and shit, water wheels to the middle of, northern cities to do steam engines and stuff. And yeah, this is just like the classic ultra left thing to like really put the working class kind of front and center again, in the kind of ongoing dynamic development of capitalism. And it's an interesting one. It really got me thinking about like what it actually means to have a self-affirming proletarian movement, because it's like what framed in this way, it's really nice because it's just like, oh, it's constantly happening. A movement for socialism is constantly happening. Like on that abstract of a level, when we live our like individual lives, it's very hard to see movements, I think, like that in these terms, because you're seeing the motivations that individual workers have. You're seeing like why these movements are happening. Oh, it's just about, affirming the wage, which whatever, like, sure, like make more money and stuff. But really, like, they're making the point that it's like, doesn't really matter if these people were like waving red flags, if, in periods of accumulation or periods of crisis. Like the class does what the class does because it is necessarily pushing back against the social relations of capitalism because it has to. And again, it, like, just to repeat myself, like it doesn't matter if it calls itself socialist or not. Like all of these movements, whether it was like, you can fiddle with the Luddite stuff a little bit, but like the development of new capitalist technologies does have the working class front and center as, the kind of primary engine for all of that. To kind of say nothing of like the general intellect of society being a like overwhelmingly proletarian thing, obviously. But it was interesting. I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it made me feel good about like what class struggle actually is. Like it doesn't necessarily have to call itself communist. Like class struggle is class struggle, I guess.
I mean, I do. There is a part of me which always worries when I have to imagine, say that I'm going to have to. I sometimes formulate this as I'm going to have to learn how to explain commodity fetishism to people to be able to effectively propagandize for socialism, right? I need to understand Isaac Rubin and I need to understand Capital Volume 1 before I can meaningfully explain to people why they're alienated and why they ought to fight for socialism. And it's important to remember that the argument that you're making, which is like, any amount of resistance, like the unfairness, the inadequacy, the alienation of the labor process is felt in different degrees, and resisted in different degrees constantly. And hopefully people understand that. Maybe they don't recognize it in the same way, or maybe there is then an opening for some deeper discussion of Marxist economics, I suppose. But yeah, it is always a reassuring thing to be reminded that, like, at some kind of basic level, the class struggle is always happening. If you take theories like this to be the basis of your socialism or the basis of your strategizing, then it's you can find a reassuring route to imagining a effective political strategy, I suppose. Also, I'm reminded of things that we came across in speaking to Phil Neal last week about like you can be a member of the Communist Party without knowing it, without declaring it, without like joining a sect. At the point when you form a grouping to practice your resistance to exploitation. That's the point when you become an active socialist, I guess.
Yeah. Everyone is a member of the Communist Party, in brackets McCarthyite. Everyone is a member of the Communist Party, in brackets good. Yeah. I mean, everyone
I don't need to explain. I don't need to explain Isaac Rubin to anyone.
Yeah. Thank God. Yeah. And I mean, it is just as simple as like every job you've ever had. It's like everybody hates their boss and everybody gets it to a certain extent. It's just the million different meaningless clouding ideologies, it's like, yeah, people get it. Now, I mean, it's all very easy to say all of this stuff, but then I inevitably want to slip back into like social democracy, because it's like, but I want it now. I don't want to have to wait for the crisis. I want like the organization to begin now, do the strategy of patience thing. And I think it's worth saying that everything that we're saying about, you can be a member of the Communist Party, like it doesn't really matter. Everybody, all proles are acting in this way no matter what, right? Like you can very like you still have to marry that with a theory of organization, because it's not like any of the examples that anyone on the ultra left or whatever like would point to happened without organization. And this is maybe like the one useful thing I took from the neither vertical nor horizontal book, where it's just like is organizations everywhere, and it's meaningless to ascribe a top down or bottom up approach to any one specific thing, because it's like that organization is just literally everywhere. And yeah, it's like the conversation we had last episode with Phil Neal, it was like, yeah, it's like rioters have organization and all of this stuff too. But you still need to, if you want to be a lowercase c communist, like you have to do your best to bring organization to these struggles, because like, yeah, you're a prole. You know what I mean? Lowercase c communists don't just sit outside the class, right? It's like you still have to make an effort to make these things happen. It's like regardless of this like at times mystical approach to everybody understanding that being a prole sucks and class society sucks, like you still got to try. I don't think that's a particularly like big brain moment, but yeah. Yeah, just to go back a little bit on the kind of like specific theories of like falling rate of profit stuff, organic composition of capital. I like their approach to Paul Matic here, because they were like, Paul Matic was like, incredibly important in pushing back against the kind of like Keynesian approach to, well, sure, there's crisis inherent in capitalism, but we can just kind of technocracy our way around it and kind of be a middle ground between labor and capital and just kind of solve it from there, and everybody can be happy. This kind of post-war compromise that I'm like only took like a few decades to completely fall apart. I did like how they kind of criticized Matic a little bit, though, for kind of saying, well, there's not really a theory here of like how class struggle happens during periods of capitalist accumulation and growth. And it's like, yeah, it's all, yeah. I think fair enough. I think what they're doing is very valuable in kind of taking the best of Matic's, Marxist defense against Keynesian attacks in the sphere of economics, but then also kind of saying, well, that doesn't just mean that there's no class struggle when things are good for capitalists and profit rates are booming. It's like there's always this underlying simmering tension. Because class society, it sucks, for lack of a better phrase, and it's exactly what we're saying.
I mean, that does highlight one of the central things that they're critiquing here, or one of the things that they're identifying this theory of decadence as being responsible for, which is a kind of like facilitating, I guess, a degree of quietism in revolutionary movements in times when capitalism is evidently not in crisis, kind of thing. Now, it sort of brings us on to their two sort of like the two groups they critique from the mid 20th century, i.e. like sort of post Second World War Trotskyism and early left communism, but the groups that they're identifying as broadly having this sort of like economistic crisis tendency central to their theorizing of capitalism and their strategic thinking as well. Yeah, it's interesting in both cases that it can, in the case of the Trotskyists, they make the argument that the Trotskyists use this as an excuse to say, well, there will come a time of revolution, and now you should all just sort of like join our organization. And really, what that means is they adopt all the strategies that we've come to associate with Trotskyism, which is like you just harvest groups for members and you sort of lie in wait and you sort of like hope to be the leaders of a revolutionary moment rather than doing anything productive to actually create that political movement, hypothetically create a revolution kind of thing. And potentially similarly for the left communists, there's a kind of like awaiting a quietism, perhaps an idea that I was kind of referencing before, that like the crisis will bring about a degree of immiseration which will necessitate a response from the working class kind of thing. So in both cases, it's kind of like an economic process and not a sort of like dual subjective and objective process, which will be the revolution, I guess.
It'll be the revolution.
Yeah.
I do think it's very funny that in all of this, like every decadence thinker from that kind of period, none of them predicted the boom, the like biggest boom, capitalist booms of all time after World War II. And then again with China too, right? It's just like it's very funny. It's like, oh, it still had that one up its sleeve. Like, what are you gonna do? It's interesting reading all of this stuff now because I mean, I could wind up completely like eating crow or whatever here in a few decades, but it's like this time it really does seem like it's going to be hard for capitalism to save itself. And that isn't to say that it's not going to keep going for quite some time. I think the decline that we're dealing with now, though, is one of that's just kind of like permanent, but the main defining feature seems to be that the ruling class just can't let any of this stuff completely collapse anymore. Like they recognize that. And whenever people say that, I always get like a little bit wary because it's like, well, to what extent did they have any control over these collapses happen? Like who was in charge during the Great Depression that was like, just let it happen. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just that kind of different technocratic fixes have been, created to a point where it's like maybe you can just do that now. Maybe you can just constantly forestall a big collapse, or you just defer I suppose what actually happened is they just deferred the collapse onto like the poorest parts of the world. And they've been living in a state of constant collapse for like half a century. But yeah, I don't know. It does feel like now it's like, yeah, but it's interesting reading theories of decline now. And like, there was a period, I think when we started this podcast where especially with all of the supply chain disruptions to COVID, like people were really getting into like, who's this Hilferding guy? Who's this Grossman guy? Like the People's Republic of Walmart stuff. Maybe we can just kind of rationally plan this stuff, but I don't know. Maybe those people will continue to be popular, but at this point, it does feel like it's a harder and harder argument to make that you can just kind of affirm all of the stuff that capitalism is doing, but put the red flag in power. But maybe not. Maybe that's just going to inevitably become something that like the downwardly mobile young professionals continue to be interested in. I don't know.
I mean, it does feel like it's interesting, and it would be interesting to in future sort of like and compare the early 20th century to this point where we're at in the early 21st century and think about the sort of like gross monopolization and the hoarding of wealth and wonder whether there's a parallel to be drawn, I suppose. And I imagine somebody, people have done this, I guess. You look at the logistical distribution network of Amazon and think, what would it mean if our socialist state had that kind of thing? Can we just appropriate these technologies for socialism? And it does seem like the left, or the sort of like the social democratic left, such that is formulating a response. It's one of, looking for solutions in alternative monetary theory, wealth taxes, like rehabilitating the state and state spending, just rehabilitating social democracy seems to be the route, sort of like the route that's being taken by people on the sort of like the left, the establishment left, I suppose, by which I mean like, supportive broadly of the regime that we live under. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen, I guess.
yeah. Feels like a constant seesaw as well between the like, de Blasio, Mamdani kind of types, and then the like, okay, but that didn't work, so let's vote for a fascist. Okay, well that didn't work. So I mean, not vote for a fascist, it's different sections of the ruling class, right? Like having, interest in various different parties happen, but it's like, yeah, I don't know. I had half a thought where it's like, who was really when I said like who was really in charge that allowed the Great Depression to happen or something like that. It's like, well, I guess there were people in charge who saw the way things were going and were like, let's just start a massive war. So, I guess to a certain extent there's that, but that's not really something you can really do, right? It's like for obvious reasons now. Last thing I just kind of want to touch on is they end up by kind of making this point that like you really cannot make the point that socialism is only justified when it becomes historically necessary for obvious moral reasons. But again, for all of the reasons that we've talked about here about needing to put the proletariat like front and center. But they kind of tie this back to a really interesting interpretation of Marx, where, you know, Marx's theories about like revolution as such becoming necessary when the productive forces come into conflict. They've outgrown the social relations of society. So there needs to be this kind of like abrupt, chaotic burst where new social relations are created over a period of time, however short, however long. They kind of say that like it's a misreading of Marx to read that as kind of a like permanent theory of revolution as such, because what Marx was trying to do there was, you know, it's the subtitle, say the subtitle. It's like, you know, a critique of political economy. Marx was criticizing capitalism on its own terms to show that by its own logic, it was a transitory and it was a transitory mode of production that would have to be superseded by something. And Marx believed that it was going to be a classless society, right? Like by virtue of the exploited class that made it up. And it's a really interesting interpretation of Marx, I think, where it's the classic, like part Marx just being very slippery with the way he writes and part his kind of like 19th century, you know, translated German that we all have to read. It's kind of a pain in the ass to read, but like you can't really read him saying that. Their interpretation is you can't really read him saying that as this kind of like permanent theory of revolution where, you know, well, socialism's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's all going to fucking collapse. Like Marx very much in his politics did put the proletariat front and center. He was just kind of making that theory of revolution to, again, criticize capitalism on its own terms to kind of show that like, hey man, by its own logic, this isn't going to work. It's interesting. It's like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm fully on board, but I like it. I'm interested.
Don't know whether I have much to say to that, but what the other thing that I did quite enjoy about this was the critique they made of a lot of people of mistaking capital for being a completed work, and for critiquing people for thinking that Marx had sort of like fully completed his project, and they're making the argument that no, like you need to read this material as being part of an open and defined and undecided project, and don't sort of like decide that the answer is definitely there and we just have to run with it. And they're saying that a lot of people have made that mistake, right? Of like, particularly people that we've referred to at the beginning of the 20th century in the social democratic movement, of like reading Marx and reading Capital and thinking all the answers are there, and forgetting that this is like a deliberately one-sided response or answer to a particular set of questions. And yeah, I don't know, but
yeah, well, existing in a long line of political economy, right? Like, yeah, you know. Where did Engels live? Where was his factory? It wasn't in Manchester, was it?
Yeah, on the outskirts of Manchester somewhere, I think.
Really? Who would he have been rooting for in the League One championship? I wonder. Stockport? Or would he have been a Bolton Wanderers kind of guy?
Yeah, you know.
It's funny. I've never even thought. I wonder what happened to his factory. Engels' factory. I wonder if Proles got made fun of for working at Engels' factory, or if it was just as shitty as every other fucking factory around them. I don't know.
I don't know what time, whether he continued to be a factory owner for the rest of his life, or who knows. Don't know enough about the biography of Frederick Engels.
Yeah. What we're reading next week, an 800-page biography of Engels. All right.
Hey.
Yeah, I like that. It was very good.
Yeah,
very good.
I mean, this is a good essay. I mean, I will say there's lots of things in this that we haven't talked about. You know, whatever. I quite like our sort of partial chats about, you know, what have we enjoyed or taken away, or you know,
what do we feel capable of talking about?
Yeah, exactly. That's more the scenario that's actually playing out, isn't it? What do we feel able to talk about at any given moment?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's worth. I mean, the first part of this especially is so good for. I mean, yeah, this is the kind of bread and butter of the podcast, is like different interpretations of the Second International debates. But yeah, the first part especially is so good. I really wish there was more at the end, because it was just kind of like 3 parts of criticism of other groups and they're thinking of decline. And I kind of thought the third part was going to be all their own stuff, but it was just criticizing Hillel Dicton and radical change. And then it was chains. And then it was like, a theory of decline is not for us. It's like, all right, whatever. Fair enough. I mean, you obviously, I think not particularly like a big brain moment for me to say, like, I think you very obviously can have a theory of decline and still put the working class front and center, because more and more it is going to, as a lowercase c communist, you are probably going to have to explain to people why everything's getting worse. And, you should probably understand that at least at some level. So whatever.
Yeah, I think that's been my takeaway from this, is not to reject, the idea that the tendential fall in the rate of profit is true, or that there are crisis tendencies or decline tendencies, but rather just remember that that's not a one-sided economic process, but actually it's a process that's resulting from class struggle. That was the thing that I appreciated having reiterated to me. It's the thing that's going to stick with me.
Good stuff. Aufheben. We read it 30 years after it was published. 30 years? Yeah, 30 years. Jesus, oh my God. What are you going to do? All right.
Well, join us next week for Theory Communist Critique of Aufhebens.
When we return. God. Yeah, we'll be reading that in the original French, so that one's going to take as well. Oh, well.
Hey, that falls foul of our first and only rule, Jack,
That's true. We've been very bad at sticking to that rule, I would say, Dan. Very bad. What are you going to do? That's partially because everything we read is French, even if it's not. What are you going to do? All right. We'll see you for next. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.